I think, have always been a customer at Nasreen Dar.
As we
Daily.
still call it, even if it's now Midan or Maidan.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And before that, of course, Malcolm's Meats.
Yes.
So Malcolm's Meats was a perfectly traditional English butcher, and perfectly good, but not wildly diverse, because that wasn't his job or his remit or what his customer base wanted. But he was a very, 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 very fine butcher. And then, of course, that changed when the wonderful Mahmoud arrived, and Nasrin Dar arrived. And that was terrific, because enormous diversity of types of stock and of different types of cuisine catered for.
Going on about today, and as it was in my time, there were all pretty little gardens in all the front ways, all the front gardens, and there were always people about. There was always, because people didn't go to work, the women didn't go to work, so there was always women at the gate talking, and you walk past and they'd talk and they'd call you in and give you a penny or an apple or something. And yeah, it was, and you knew everybody along the road. As you say, it was really, I mean, and the same with the shops. They'd all know you. I think you know all about the shops, don't you? So I don't need to go into that.
Well, yes and no. I mean, the thing is that lots of people have said they remember this shop and that shop.
I could tell you every shop that was down there.
But I suppose, I think what you're so good at, it was the interaction. What would happen when you went into the shop, and what would you talk about?
Well, there was Mr. Westrop's shop, which is now Headlines, the hairdressers, and I suppose at the time we used to seem to go in there quite a bit, but it was wooden floors. It was only lit by gaslight. It was so dark in there, and when it got to a dark, even during the day, it always seemed to be dark in there. But you'd go in there, and there would be a smell of creosote and paraffin.
Oh, right.
And it was very dark, and his counter was very high. And you'd go in there, and you couldn't see anything hardly. And then suddenly, "Can I help you?" And you'd look, and he'd jump, because and he wasn't very big, and his little head would pop up behind the counter. And I can always remember that. But that was a sort of general hardware store, because I can remember sort of what do you call it, aluminium bars, buckets and bars and things like that in there. But I think he did vegetables. But then on the opposite side of the road was Phillips. And I realise now, because obviously they sold flowers, because that would be useful for the cemetery, for people going to the cemetery to get the flowers. Now, that never occurred to me before. Never occurred to me before. I don't know how long the Phillips family had that shop, but it was right. Oh dear, it's so difficult today, because things just aren't there. But it was on the corner of Bermuda Terrace, and it went down quite a little way, because he had a sort of yard attached to it, and it went round the corner, and round the corner it was the glass windows, and he used to breed chickens, and the lights would be on, and their little baby chicks were all running around there. And I don't know what all that was about, because as far as I know, he never sold chickens to eat. I just don't know what that was about. He sold the chicks, and they did lots of wreaths. You see, that was what they first went in for. They always sold wreaths, and they always did the holly wreaths at Christmas time. But Bert Phillips. Now that's another thing. Yeah, my mum. Going back to, there was Mr. and Mrs. Phillips who owned the shop. Mrs. Phillips was a large lady, and she was, and dear Ernie, always singing, always humming away, but he was a bit under her thumb. Going back to the railings that were around, I lived in 75A Histon Road, which was opposite what was the what was it called? Not the British Queen, the other one, Prince of Wales pub, and it's now the tandoori curry place. And we had railings around the house, and I can remember them coming and cutting all the railings off around the front garden. And I was quite upset, and I remember picking them up off the garden and putting them by the curb, and a policeman came along and told me I shouldn't do it, and I was so embarrassed.
The wreck is just marvellous these days. It's got all sorts of equipment, all sorts of areas, landscaping. Wasn't like that at all when I was a child. It was very rudimentary play equipment. And I don't think I spent much time on it, to be honest. I just don't think I went to play there very much.
It was a little bit rough.
It was a little bit rough, I agree with you, yes. And I just didn't spend much time there at all. So that has been transformed over the years. It's just unrecognisable, really.
It's lovely, isn't
It's lovely,
it? Now?
yeah.
And there
really
weren't so
nice.
many trees or.
That's
you know,
right,
so-
yes, all of that stuff. Yes, the only thing that looks vaguely familiar is the ditch at the back.
Yes, and the fact that people call it the park, which you would never have called it before, because it is a bit more park-like now.
I suppose you might
Lots of
do if you
newcomers
didn't.
call
Yeah,
it the
the
park.
newcomer. Oh, yeah, yeah. It was always a wreck, I remember.
Yeah.
So that's completely changed.
There wasn't much. There wasn't anything really in the way of entertainment there. None of, there's a fenced-off children's playground there now, and a few sort of swings and roundabouts, that sort of thing for them to play on. But there was none of that then. It was just grass, and there was, I think there were loos there, and this hut where Curly used to hang out, and he was there all day long, keeping an eye on the place, on us. But that was it, really. It was just really a grassy area to play in. I can't remember even if there were any swings there. I don't ever remember going on them, but as far as I remember, it was just grass. But it was just an open space to play on. But
Do you remember what sort of games you used to play?
they used to come in fashion, hopscotch and marbles. These things used to come round every year. Seasonal things. There's
That's it. Yes, this was another story which I've got the cutting from the newspaper, and I can very well remember I can remember being in. We didn't have any electricity in the house; it was just a candlelight, and I'd gone to bed, and I woke up, and I could hear all these fire engines and noise and that going down the road. And I couldn't think what was happening. It was pitch dark because I was in the dark, but the lights were reflecting around the room. And I went downstairs and they said, "Don't worry, there's a plane crash down the road and your brothers have gone to see what's happening." And what had happened, this aeroplane had come down about 100 yards away from us. And sadly, there was a little shop. These two little ladies kept this little grocery shop on Histon Road, and sadly it had come down and taken the bedroom and the roof of that and the houses next door and landed on a tennis court by the side of it. And my brothers next morning, or sometime during the following week, just sort of went and wandered all over it, and they actually cut a piece out of the side of the plane and they made a plate with it. They also cut so the windows, which were sort of, I suppose, sort of perspex stuff, I don't know what you'd call it, and made jewellery. They made rings and they made locket. All the boys were doing that, all the kids around there were going and doing this sort of thing. And I've still got the plate, and the plate, must have been around February, because they made this plate for my aunt, and her birthday was on the 28th of February, and they gave it to her. They actually put her name on it, and they put the 28th of February, but they spelt February wrong, so it's there forevermore spelt wrongly. Yes, sadly there were 3 people were killed in that when that plane came down. But there's a lovely photograph which was that they took for the paper, and what amuses me is there's no ribbons around or anything to say you mustn't go on it. It was just sort of left, and there's the chest of drawers still on the bedroom of the with no roof or anything else. But and I imagine that the old lady's clothes were still inside those drawers, because you didn't get any stealing or anything.
So the street has changed. Well, everybody says this about the streets around here, from people who were born and brought up
Yes.
in Cambridge
Yes.
to increasingly people who've come to,
Yes.
our transient community. Lots more academics.
Yes, indeed. And I suppose that's partly to do with the hideous way in which Cambridge house prices just steadily keep on pushing out people who would like to live in Cambridge and like to buy in Cambridge and simply cannot afford to. We see that happening all the time. My own ex-partner bought in Ely because she couldn't have afforded to buy in Cambridge, and now I think people who might have lived in Ely because they couldn't afford to live in Cambridge have to move even further. They have to move out to Soham or Chatteris or something like that. So it's a steady pattern of people being forcibly dislocated, really, from the area they might like to live in, which is not so hot.
So you were aware of that in the academic community as well.
I was aware of that. I was aware of that, and it's a strange contradiction because, of course, yes, the house prices get pushed up because that is the Cambridge factor, and yet. The bizarre thing that has happened is that although the people you might think of as being the more natural inhabitants of those houses often can no longer afford them, it's also the case that because academic salaries have in real terms fallen, that academics are living in the sort of house that, quotes, they shouldn't, close quotes, that they are underhoused, in contrast with the sort of dwelling they might have expected to be living in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. So everything's getting pushed downwards, as it were, or been pushed out. If you're somebody who would have very much pleased have liked to live in the same streets as your parents or your grandparents lived in.
St John's College had used to run this soup club, and it was for all the families. For the poor and needy, I suppose they would have said in those days, the poor and needy, they would make this so that they had a good meal. They'd make this soup and bread, and we used to have to take a large container and a tea towel or a towel. It wasn't a tea towel; it would be a towel, to St John's College. And we'd go to the kitchens, and we would all be waiting there, and there would be like a pulpit. What do you call it?
A lectern.
A lectern, yeah. And it would all be laid out with a little table, and there'd be a tray, and there'd be a silver dish and a silver spoon. Or this is what it looked like to us, and we'd have to wait until and I used to think it was the master of the college, and it possibly could have been, or it could have been the head chef or what, but whoever it was, they were in gowns and a mortarboard, and they would go up these steps, and they would take one taste of the soup, and if they thought it was good enough, they would allow it to be used. I never saw it declined, but we always thought it might be. And as soon as he'd nod his head, and then we'd all rush forward and get with our containers to be filled up with soup. And we'd get 2 loaves of bread. I don't know if that was according to how many children you got to feed, but we had 2 loaves of bread, and we had, and then had as much soup as you could take. But it used to slop all over the Histon Road, because we used to have to carry it back from St John's College to Aikman Street. It was quite a thing with boiling soup. I mean, you wouldn't dream of being able to do things like that. But I mean, obviously some had lids on, but I can remember ours didn't have a lid on it, or it may have done, but it was slopping over, but it was beautiful soup. And I read somewhere, I did a bit of research, and I read what the master, insisted on it being good quality, and they had a recipe for it. And interestingly, when meat became difficult to get hold of, the college owned lots of big houses, and they used to have their own deer. And we actually had venison in the soup quite often because it was the only way of getting meat.
I joined the allotments about 1995, which, believe me, is sort of a new boy when it comes to some of them. I mean, you saw that photograph of Alan and Cyril in the shop. Well, Alan's been doing it for, I should imagine, over 40 years. It's incredible to think that people have done that. But then I've been retired for 27 years, so as you get older, this sort of happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course, you wouldn't have had the time to...
I never had an allotment before I retired.
No.
And I just found that I had no time. So it was about 1995 I joined, put forward that I should become chairman. Because if there's one thing I can do, it's talk. And that they could see that's what and negotiate, of course. So I had no problems coming in. What happened was, it was just for a chairman, the wrong time. Because we were coming up to 100 years. See, 1911, that's when we were formed.
Yeah.
So when I said the shed was down the bottom of Garden Walk, that was where the first council houses were built, for Bateson Road, going through Ayton Street and that's where the shed was.
So the Allotment Society was formed in 1911, is that right? But
No,
also,
the Cheston Allotment Society.
Oh, the Cheston Allotment Society.
Just the Cheston Allotment Society.
Right.
I'm not saying that we're the first in East Anglia,
No,
but we're one of the first in
Allotments-
Cambridge. Yeah. And we were by far the biggest. And we were huge at one time. Presumably, well, we had Hall Farm. Presumably it was called Hall Farm. We had that farm in there. We had 2 tithe houses. And in actual fact, to be fair, the allotment went from the end of Bateson Road to Arbury Road. And Arbury Road from Milton Road through to Cambridge Road. So that was allotment.
How many acres?
200 about 275.
Gosh.
That's huge when you think about it. Even now we're a big society and we're 12.5 acres.
Your house is famous, Alison, isn't it?
Or
And
notorious, as the
people-
case may be. He's known as the Book House, I gather. And indeed, recently when a charming computer consultant came to sort me out, and I opened the door to him, never having met him, he said, I can't believe I'm actually entering this house. I used to live in this area. I don't anymore. I used to. And so often I would walk past this house late at night when your curtains weren't drawn and the lights were on, and I would look and think, I wonder who lives there. So I can't believe that now I know who lives there. Also, he said, my father would have loved it because he was a bookbinder for Cambridge University Press, and he would have loved that.
Your brother, after the plane, had rushed round to Huntington Road.
Oh, yes.
And there was a
And
woman, and we were...
yes.
Anyway, you
that was,
yeah.
yes, I can't believe that I actually must have spoken to Anna's mother.
Yeah, to my mum.
Were you there at the time?
No, this
That was before you were born?
No, because I was born in 1954.
Oh, yeah, well, it was long before you were born.
Yeah, so my parents were married for quite a time before all of us, the children turned up. So they were at 10 Huntington Road. Mum, it was at night, and Mum was
Yeah.
in bed.
Yes, it would make
She was
sense.
teaching herself the ukulele. So she was sitting up in bed, playing the ukulele. Dad
Yeah.
was off. He was working in London at the time at the Admiralty. And this bomb landed but didn't go off on the doorstep. I say it
So
didn't
that
go
was
off.
the damage. It did the damage
It
without
did the
blowing. I
damage.
wondered why it didn't,
Yeah.
because I remember going.
And you went round? You went
Yes,
round.
and so it could easily have been the next morning.
Yeah.
And I couldn't remember that, but I remember going round to Huntington Road because they said that something had happened on Huntington Road. It was just at the top of Histon Road. It wasn't very far, and I remember going there, and I remember seeing the damage that had been done to this house. I can't remember exactly. I suppose the windows had been blown, had they?
windows had been blown out.
And something had happened, and I suppose there was a mess because they'd probably taken the bomb away. I don't know, or it might even still have been there, because I know there were bits all over the road. And this lady came down the steps with a bunch of flowers in her hand, and she said to me, "Would you like to take these home to your mummy?" Because she said, "I haven't got any vases anymore, and I have nowhere to put them." And that we think that must have been Anna's mum.
Must have been. Yes, I think so.
And I think it's just so just amazing that, you know, after all these years. But yes, that could very well have been that.
And it's why that house, which is number 10 Huntington Road, when the windows were replaced, they were replaced as 2 panes instead of 4-pane windows, because there was something to do with the supply of glass or something.
Yes, yeah.
Well, we bought. I had, because in those days we weren't married when we bought the house. So the house, I had to buy the house and finance it because there was no second income sort of allowed by the mortgage company. So it was 1968 we actually bought it.
And I was a pupil midwife. I
You
didn't
were-
have any money at all.
Well, I didn't. I
But between David managed to get a mortgage.
I managed to get a mortgage by deceit because I was working for Gerald Turk. We were Scottsdale then, and I didn't earn enough money. You got your mortgage in those days based on 3 times your salary, which was very sensible. And I didn't earn £1,000 a year then, which is inconceivable to think about now, isn't it? I mean, that's what you expect to earn a month. So Gerald, I went to Gerald and I said, "Gerald, can you write me a letter, please, and say that I'm paid more than I am?" He said, "Well, I will, so long as you don't hold it against me." So we went along and saw the mortgage manager at the Abbey National, as it was then, and he said, "Oh, that's okay. That's okay."
So we've been here 51
So
years.
51 years.
You couldn't get mortgages. I think when it was, I was about 25, I should think. So that's 36, 46, 56, about 1960, 61, looking for a mortgage. Couldn't get one, though they were building lots of houses. And then I had a lad, well, my boss came up from Stratford Depot, and he said I could get a mortgage, or he'd get me a mortgage, which I thought he was joking. I've got the bit of paper upstairs, in actual fact. Mr. Maggs, Leeds Permanent Building Society, 1 Waterloo Place, with a phone number, Whitehall, not 1212, but Whitehall something else, and best to phone to make an appointment. So I saw him. I had to tell him that I was railway, and Leeds Permanent Building Society took over the Great Eastern Bank, and one of the agreements was that they would give 3 mortgages a year, and that had died out. No one knew about it. That's how Frank got his mortgage, and that's how I got my mortgage. And then Janet, poor little devil, she had to marry me, didn't she? Well, she wouldn't marry me until we got a house. I think she thought she was on a great thing. She loved her home in Hazeldenfield, but I managed to beat her on that.
And I bought my house in 1977. It had been on the market for some time. It had been empty for about a year. I think the previous owner's marriage had come apart and they'd gone their separate ways. So the house was still partly furnished. And I was trusted by the estate agent simply to stay in it. They showed me around and then they went away. And they said, "But I like to stay in it a bit and get the feel of it." And I liked the feel of it very, very much. And my mother, who made it possible for me to buy it by virtue of giving me £500 for a deposit. My father had died quite recently, and she said, "I know he would like me to do this." So that made it possible for me. I had no job, which makes me a very unlikely person to be allowed to buy a house. But there was a company called C.C. Lee, which I think still exists, though Mr. Lee has long since, I assume, gone to join the Brokers in the Sky. And Mr. Lee permitted himself at least one silly human investment per year, in the sense that he would use his considerable power to persuade the Cambridge Building Society to offer a mortgage to an, on the face of it, supremely unpromising person. And that year, for complicated reasons, I was that person. So the house had been on the market for £11,500, and it has stuck and stuck and stuck and stuck. So the price had come down to 11. So with the £500 from my mother, I had a mortgage for £10,500. Nevertheless, the mortgage repayments, which were £63 a month initially, were a third of my income. So although it sounds absurd and everyone says, oh, you were so lucky, it was a third of my income. I know these days, bizarrely, people, have mortgages that are many, 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 many times their income. I don't know how they sleep at night. They probably don't. But that's how.
Or the photographer, again, because hadn't got any money. My mother-in-law had a friend who said he could do wedding photographs. So we had the wedding at the church, and we then went on to the reception at the Guildhall, and then we went on a honeymoon to Eastbourne. And my sister and her friend travelled with us in the train up to London because they were going on holiday. I can remember that was how we started our life. We had a fantastic weather. Although it was Easter, we had very good weather. And it was interesting because we took our umbrellas, but we didn't need to use them. But the interesting thing was, when we got home, about 3 weeks later, we went out to a restaurant to have a meal. And we took our umbrellas because it was wet, and John put the umbrella up and all this confetti fell out because his aunt had packed the umbrella with confetti, thinking that we would be using it on our honeymoon. So there were a few questions asked about that.
Yeah.
I'll message him later.
If not, I'll just check.